Hebrews 2:14-15. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Ken, I will try. We are continuing in our series, What Christians Believe. We are this week in the Apostles' Creed, dealing with Jesus went down to Hades. Jesus went down to hell. Jesus descending down. That's why we read 882 this morning. How many of you had ever done 882 with that version? A couple. It's pretty controversial, and we'll get to that. It may not have felt controversial to you, but we'll get to that. This Hebrews text, they're trying to explain that Jesus not only has the power of a great teacher, not only the power of a rabbi, but he has the power over death itself. Jesus Jesus brings the funeral for death. Jesus walks in the funeral for death. Death has no more power. Death has no more sting. Death has no more oomph. And for those who have lived their lives in slavery for the fear of death, he has freed them. Now, so here's the question. Does that mean those who are alive and are held in bondage? Or does that mean the ones who've already died? Do you know the name Janelle Guzman McMillan? She was working in the tower that day. She was up towards the top. She was the last survivor found. She tells the story, she remembers of hearing the pop, and she and those on her floor, the people that she worked with, assumed it was a small plane, and the tower would hold. It would withstand that. They knew that it would hold. But some of the folks decided to go on down and didn't risk it, and they left, and she stayed with her friends and her workers, and they saw the smoke, and they began to wet clothes and to wet anything that they had to block the doors to keep the smoke out. She began to talk to friends and family on the phone, and when they began to tell them this is what's happening, she realized she needed to get out. And so she and others began to descend the steps. She was going down the steps with one of her best friends, and she said, I made the decision to keep my high heels on. So picture her running down those stairs in high heels. And she said, the reason I kept them on is because I knew that the ground was going to be bad, and I did not want to be walking through glass and tearing up my shoes, so I kept my shoes on. After about 15 floors, she decided to worry about the ground when she got there and took off the high heels. She said, but about the time she took off her high heels, it collapsed, and she was trapped. She said, for 27 hours, I lay in rubble. For 27 hours, my voice gone, my lungs filled with smoke. The only thing she said she could move with her left arm and hand just a little bit. She said when she finally came to, there was a man that was standing there talking to her and holding her hand and would not let go of her hand and telling her, hang in there, don't go to sleep, hang in there, you're going to be okay, hang in there. And she could begin after about, they think 15, 16 hours, starting to hear voices screaming and shouting and calling out. But her voice was gone from fear, from frustration, from dust in her lungs, and she couldn't speak. And she said finally her friend, whose name was Paul, who was squeezing her hand, said to her, you have to holler now, or they will never find you. And she hollered, and they found her. You know who they did not find with her as they found her? Anyone else. As I have studied this story, as I have looked at it at the different places, you get a different feel. You get a different reporting. One of the places I read was People magazine. They had no idea what to do with it. Newsweek, different media outlets reported it, and they would say, for 20 years she has looked for Paul, but he disappeared into the day. She's written a book, From the Rubble, where she says very clearly, Paul was my angel. The world has no idea what to do with Paul. The world has no idea what to do with Jesus. But let me say to you, don't get nervous, don't get anxious in this moment. The world has never, ever known what to do with Jesus. We hear this story and we see this story and we feel the stress of the world around it trying to explain who this was holding her hand. Was it her subconscious? Was it someone who did get away? But it surely can't be an angel. She's very clear. Paul was her angel. It's interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of the first ones that I want to talk to you about here is, like I said, Jesus, they didn't know what to do with him. The church didn't know what to do with him. And this Apostles' Creed, which I am a huge Apostles' Creed believer in, I say it every day, not just on Sunday. The earliest version of the Apostles' Creed is 337 AD. Now think about it for a second. That means roughly 300 years after Jesus' death, the church has been trying to articulate. The church has been trying to find words to explain who Jesus is and how we believe in Jesus. And in 359 AD, 22 years later, Jesus descending into hell becomes present for the first time. For 22 years, Christians discussed and spoke these words and presented these words, and not descended into hell was not there. So let me tell you what was happening. Do you know the name St. John Chrysostom? Chrysostom, I can't get it right. I can't get this one right, Constantinople. He was the leader in the church at that point, and he addressed what the church was calling the harrowing of Hades. So here's what's happening. The original witnesses of Jesus, the original followers of Jesus, would go out and they would witness and they would tell, and the disciples would fall and they'd struggle. But these people who knew Jesus so closely would say, I knew him. I was there. I saw him. I was part of the feeding of the 5,000. Grandparents would be sitting there going, my grandbaby was starving, and he was screaming. She was shouting. They were so hungry. And Jesus took a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish, and he made the best fish sandwich I have ever eaten in my life. And my hungry grandchild ate. They had your attention. And these witnesses that would see it, and then the next generation, the witnesses of the witnesses would say, my grandmother used to tell this story about when Jesus was hungry and I was hungry. And they would begin to tell these stories and they would change. But now 300 years later, go back 300 years. How much has the world, how much have we changed? How much has the country changed? How much has everything changed in 300 years? Well, 300 years later, that much change had occurred as well. And now 300 years later, this band of misfits, this band of disciples, these fishermen, these folks that were on the edges, this religion is now being presented as the religion of the most powerful nation on earth. Constantine is beginning this conversation. St. John is beginning this conversation on who Jesus is and how he believed Jesus, and developing this understanding, developing this line of thought to be able to explain this is who Jesus is. And most importantly, this is who the Lord is. Because prior to this, who was the Lord? Whoever was in charge of Rome. And so this major change is occurring, that it's not the most powerful military figure, it's not the most powerful general anymore, it is God. And how we're going to articulate that. And they begin to articulate it. They begin to put it together. And you see these words of the Apostles' Creed coming out. You see this development coming through. You see this change happening. Let me fast forward 1,400 years. No, 1,100 years. Crusades, wars, fighting all around religion is occurring. And part of what's happening is the church is still trying to define itself. 1,100 years later, even more change, trying to figure out who it is and what it is. And they're trying to explain it to people who can't read, the majority of which can't read. And so how do we communicate something so powerful? How do we find a medium? How do we find a way to communicate who God is? And the church does something brilliant. It goes to the arts community. It goes to the community of arts. And it says, we want to pay you. We want to hire you to start painting the gospel, to start painting the Bible. Are you with me? And some of the most famous art in all history is art that's based around church, that's based around faith, that's based around the gospel. But there's a problem. Have you found it yet? How are we going to paint when we disagree on so much? All right, let me go back now to 300, to the mid-300s, the mid-4th century. This new religion of the nation, of the people, how do you convince people to make this religion when part of their religion, a major part of this religion, is your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents are in hell? Let's sit here for a second. How do I get all of these people, how do I get all of this nation, how do I get all these folks to sign off on this Jesus that's for you, that's for me, that we love? Yeah, you folks that, the grandparents and the folks that didn't get that chance, they're in hell. What are we going to do with that? And so we've got the Hebrews text, Ken. We've got this Hebrews text that tells those who were afraid of fear, those who were afraid of death, those who were worried about the power of death, it's no longer here. Well, are we talking about people who are alive, or are we talking about people who are dead? And they go, yes. Yes. They say yes. And then there's the text in Peter. There's text in Peter where it's talking about Jesus going in and rescuing. And then there's the Matthew text where Matthew says Jesus is going to be like Jonah. Just like Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the well, Jesus is going to spend 3 days in the belly of the earth. And like any good preacher, they could stretch those texts and make them theologically work. Like any good preacher. You've seen preachers stretch stuff. Here, they stretched it. And they went at that point because they had to be able to communicate to people who Jesus is. And at the end of the day, what was important was Jesus can go anywhere, anytime, any place, anyhow, anyway. There is nothing that God and Jesus ever created that is off limits to Jesus. And so the first image, the first art piece that I want to show you, and it's literally parts of thousands. We see this teaching, and this is in the 1400s. We see this image of Jesus with the halo. We know it's Jesus. And he's standing there, and he's standing over one of the guards. Now remember the conversation of paradise? Remember the conversation of Sheol? This is Jesus stepping, and you can see where the doors have been knocked down, the gates have been knocked down. This is Jesus reaching down in and pulling out the ancestors with Adam and Eve and King David. This is Jesus reaching down into and pulling people out of Sheol. This is Jesus has gone into, and that between that day and a half, between his death and resurrection, Jesus has been going into this place. And you just read it. Give me the second one, please. This one's my favorite. This is Jesus standing in paradise with Sheol beneath them. You can see the doors beneath them. Adam by one wrist, Eve by the other. They're communicating that there is nowhere Jesus can't get to. There is nowhere that Jesus can't go. If your parents grew up Jewish, or your family or your grandparents grew up Jewish, you care about this a whole lot in the 1400s. Do you feel how controversial it was? Some of you read it this morning and you went, ooh, and that's okay. When John Wesley gets into the 1700s, when he gets to the 18th century, do you know what John Wesley said about this? Both. There's writings where John Wesley was ready for Jesus to go attacking the gates of hell and pulling people out of it. There's writings where John Wesley went, ooh, scripturally, I'm not really sure about that. He said both. Was he running? Was he hiding? If you'll take your hymnal out, turn to page 882 again. Why do we have them both? In the 1989 hymnal is when we made the change. In the 1700s, when John Wesley was doing the prayer book, it was in there and then it was out. It was in there and then it was out. In the 1900s, it bounced back and forth. And you know what John Wesley finally said? This is not the important part, whether or not Jesus went into hell. What's important is that after 3 days, he arose. What's important is that what you believe is that Jesus died for our sins, for the atonement, through the atonement of his blood. We have sin. We have no more sin in our lives. We have power. We have hope. We have peace and eternity with Jesus Christ. And that we believe after 3 days he came back, rose from the dead, which defeats death. What happened in that day and a half, you can believe whatever brings you close to Jesus. It's not an essential. It's not an essential. Now, let me sit with you for a minute. Can you feel how stressful that is for folks who are hearing that for the first time? Can you feel how stressful that is in the 300s and then in the 1400s? What do you mean? It doesn't matter what Jesus did for 36 hours? If you're pretty excited about that resurrection at the end, it doesn't. The Via Media. It's in the hymnal because we believe in the Via Media. We believe that you can believe in both. We believe that you can find both. It's who we are as United Methodists, that we can disagree on the non-essentials. It's who we are as United Methodists, that there is a place for both. The reason 881 and 882 is because we are a both-and people, not an either-or people. And it's here in the most important part of our entire faith of what Jesus is doing in death and resurrection, and what Jesus is doing in hope and peace and power and life. When they began to make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and the churches began to take off. Do you know who read these? Where the Apostles' Creed started? They didn't start in the church every Sunday like we did it. When people got baptized, when folks came forward for baptism, this was what they read. This is what they did. This is how it implemented. It was a statement of faith, a statement of life. Yeah, I must say it. Hear this pastorally, please. Please, hear this pastorally. 21 years later, we know what religious extremism looks like. We know what it looks like when someone says it has to be this way. We know what it looks like when someone says you have to believe the way I believe. When we're ready to use violence, when we're ready to use, and there's crusades and fights throughout the history of war. But in the middle of all that is Jesus Christ saying, I came to give you life. I came to give you hope. I came to give you peace. I came to give you me. Me. It sits in our hymnal right there together, right next to one another to remind us that there are things that we disagree about. But the thing that unites us is Jesus himself. And that is the only thing worth fighting over. Let's go to the Lord's table.